everyone, and welcome to a very spooky Halloween edition of the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Tonight's episode is a little different. You'll hear my voice, but mainly you'll hear the voices of 13 other narrators. I'm a huge fan of all of these narrators. Some of them I'm lucky enough to call my friends. Each one of them is wildly talented, and I can't thank them enough for being a part of this episode. For anyone not subscribed, be sure to check out the description. I've linked all their channels below. Well, I had a ton of fun putting this together, and I hope you enjoy the show. So, let's get started, shall we? Years ago, I lived in a small southwest middle-of-nowhere town. Senior year of high school, one of my friends had been dating a boy that attended the local university. They'd been together since before he graduated our high school the year prior. His fraternity was throwing a Halloween house party, and we were invited. Quick in an effort not to get confusing, Zoe and Sarah are my friends. Zoe is dating the frat boy, Anton. Okay. Halloween falls on a Saturday that year, so Sarah, Zoe, and we've spent all day together, finding some revealing costumes, doing our hair and makeup in the bathroom mirrors for hours. And at that moment in time, I can say that it was all in hopes to catch the attention of a popular Phi Zeta Kappa boy. Our hopes fell short on arrival, as it looked like the party had already been raging for hours. The sun hadn't even set yet when we pulled up. The house was packed with drunk college kids, the volume of talking only in competition with the music playing from speakers strategically placed around the house. Stepping through the doorway, it felt like I entered another world, populated with creatures speaking with a sloppy, mashed dialect, resembling English, but far too unintelligible for meaning to be derived. Zoe takes the lead and starts pushing her way through the crowd, looking for Anton. As fate were to have it, it doesn't take long to spot him. Just above the heads of the faceless crowd, two hairy legs are hoisted above the masses. Someone is taking a cake stand in the kitchen. And we immediately recognize the beat-up Converse brushing against the ceiling. A few more solid shoves and we break our way through the traffic of bodies into the kitchen area. Just as we do, Anton is sucking on the cake spout as two of his friends hold his legs and cheer him on. When Anton gets down, he stumbles over and hugs onto Zoe. And then, like clockwork, he throws up down her back. As the warm liquid splashes in her hair and on the floor behind her, I can see Zoe's eyes fill up with tears. Two of Anton's friends help them down to the washroom downstairs. Zoe locks the two of them in there, and she spends the rest of the night trying to clean Anton in the shower and clean herself. Now, it's just Sarah and I in this chaotic atmosphere of strangers. Sarah's a good extrovert to have around, though. She didn't let Anton's party foul delegate the evening. Immediately, she starts chatting up these two handsome but very intoxicated guys. They offer us some mixed drinks. Sarah sips on hers, but as I'm about to put the straw in my mouth, a big, shirtless guy, he snatches the drink out of my hand and he downs it, and just as he finishes, he does a big Ric Flair woo. The two guys we were talking to get pissed and start yelling at this guy. It totally killed the vibe, watching these two men revert to cavemen as they puffed their chest and shouted at this guy. I decided to excuse myself to the restroom. Since Zoe and Anton are occupying the downstairs bathroom, I had to walk up to the second floor. At the top of the stairs, I could see the upstairs was pretty empty. The upstairs is pretty much just a long hallway with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. At the end of the hallway is the bathroom. The door was open and the light is on. a green light for me to hightail it in there for a moment away from the party beneath. I walk in, and I'm nearly startled off of my feet. Just standing in there, looking down at the floor, I see the same guy who had stolen my drink minutes before. He looks up at me, confused, and he says something like,
"What just happened?"
I'm like, "Oops, sorry," and I slam the door shut. I'm still stone cold sober, and now a bit terrified that this guy made it up the stairs and past me without detection. Seconds before I started walking upstairs, he was getting shoved around by two guys in the kitchen. This is where all of these years later, I still don't know how to concisely explain the next events that followed. So, big guy's in the upstairs bathroom. I turn and I walk downstairs, and people are filing out of the house like rats in a drain. Looking off the stair banister, I can see into the kitchen. A group of people are standing, clustered in a circle. Making my way back in past the dwindling crowd, I see that the small cluster of people are circled around a body lying motionless on the floor. Upon closer inspection, I realize that it's the big guy on the ground. I'm in disbelief. I spin around and I run back up the stairs. I open the bathroom door. It's now empty. I run back downstairs, and the few people still in the house are still around the body. Minutes later, paramedics file in and they can't resuscitate him. He's thrown onto a gurney and wheeled out to an ambulance. The house becomes quiet, and the ones still there begin to start slowly picking up cups and streamers. The shock of it all threw us into some strange autopilot, and we all began to clean the house. I go downstairs to check on Zoe and Anton. They've fallen asleep in a pile of towels on the washroom floor together. Then, I realize I haven't seen Sarah in the midst of all this. I comb through the house with no luck. I end up going outside and I find her sleeping in her car. The doors are locked and I have to pound on the window to wake her up. I hadn't drank that night, so I ended up driving us both home. The next day, we went back to Zoe and we found out what really happened to the big guy. Apparently, and this was originally from big guy's little brother's friends, but apparently he had died from a toxic overdose of GHB. The two gentlemen attempting to feed us drinks, they'd also tried to spike our drinks, but they were obviously too drunk and dosed the cups with far too much. Sarah said when she lost track of me, she started to feel really woozy, so she went outside and locked herself in the car. Luckily, she'd only taken the one drink before the whole scene erupted. It was a very smart move on her part, going to the car. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if she stayed there, or worse, finished her drink. Technically, we, or at least I, owe my life to that big guy, the one who stole my drink. I hope in the afterlife he knows how grateful I am.
This happened when I was 16. It was Halloween in my small town of South Louisiana. It was a crisp night. The temperature was in the mid-80s, and the heat showed no sign of slacking off. I was walking around with my older sister and our friend Brooke. My sister had gone as a cat, and Brooke had gone as a witch. I had made the awful decision of wearing a formal gown, since I decided to go as a zombie prom queen. I had a crown and everything. I was drowning in that dress though. It was so hot and the corset back was restricting my breathing. It was around 8:40 and all of the kids were pretty much cleared out of the street. We were making our way to the park next to City Hall, where my mother was supposed to pick us up. We were supposed to be there for 9. The 3 of us were about 6 blocks away at this point, and my sister had stopped to talk to a friend of hers. I was not stopping though. It was close to time for my mum to pick us up, and I wasn't going to be late. I was also miserable in that stupid dress and wanted to go home. I had carried on for almost 2 blocks before I had noticed that both my sister and her friend had stayed behind. I was annoyed, to say the least, but I only had 4 more blocks to go, and I could lay down in my mother's minivan. Being alone in the dark was starting to give me the creeps. The yellow streetlights didn't do the ambience any favors. I'd kept my pace and kept walking, until I heard the rumble of a muffler coming up behind me. I moved all the way off the road. The large black truck came past very quickly and turned to the left in front of me. I passed the intersection, and I only had 3 blocks left. Then I heard the truck again. I'd never moved back on the road, so I didn't bother looking back. It wasn't too strange that the same truck had passed again. The 3rd time they passed, though, they slowed for a good 30 seconds or so, and that's what scared me. I didn't recognize the truck, and the windows were tinted heavily. As soon as I thought I could see a bit of a face, they peeled out and disappeared around a corner. I made another block before I heard the truck again. I was 2 blocks away from my ride, and I was scared and started running. I already couldn't breathe because of the dress, and was terrified I would pass out. As soon as I heard the truck, my stomach wrenched. I still kept going, only a good bit faster than I had been. I kept my eyes down and watched my own shadows as the headlights came closer. I heard the brakes, and I had made the decision to run. But I was too late. I realized how close they were to me. I felt a sharp pain on the back of my head, and I looked up the best I could to see an arm sticking out of the window. An eagle clutching a sword was tattooed on his upper forearm. He had my hair wrapped around his fist. Before I could really comprehend the situation, he pumped the gas and was dragging me alongside of his truck. I was running as best I could, clawing his arm, crying and screaming. The only thing that kept running through my mind was that if I tripped, I was going to be run over. This man was just laughing. I was completely helpless. As soon as it started, he let me go. I fell to my knees on the asphalt, tore my dress, skinned my palms, and my scalp was on fire. I was inconsolable, and I was hyperventilating. I stood up, wiped my face, then looked around and felt absolutely violated. I looked back at the way I'd come from and realized that this man had dragged me by my hair for a whole block and a half. Once I caught my head, I ran across the street to the park. My mother was nowhere to be seen. I climbed into the enclosed slide and just curled up and cried. I don't know how long I was lying there for before I heard my mother calling my name. I came out, and she was walking up the street calling for me. I walked over to her and she looked me up and down and began freaking out. Apparently, I had blood on my face and dress from my hands. She ran to me and was asking me what happened and kept looking me up and down for a gash or something worse. I couldn't find my voice. I just held onto her and cried. We spent the next few hours at the police station filling out a report. Long story short, nothing ever came of it. My sister got into trouble with my parents for not being at the city hall on time. She was grounded. My mother had actually left City Hall to go and look for us. She found my sister where I left her, and my sister hadn't even realized that I never stayed. I got in trouble for not staying with my sister, but I didn't get grounded. I'm still pretty mad that the dress was ruined and I lost the damned crown. I'm even angrier that the man was never caught. This Halloween, I will be out with my godchild trick-or-treating. It'll be the first one that I've gone out for in the 9 years since it happened.
I was sort of shy and anxious in school, especially elementary school. There were only a couple of kids whom I was friends with, and they were my neighbors. One Halloween, when I was in the 4th grade, we had all agreed to go trick-or-treating together in a different neighborhood. At first, I hesitated because of pure anxiety, but ultimately agreed because I did not want to miss out. When it started to get dark, one of their moms took us to the other neighborhood, dropping us off at the top of a hill and telling us to be back at the top within an hour. While exiting the car, I had this horrible feeling, and I didn't know where it was coming from. Too late to figure it out. Upon closing the doors and while having unknown internal panic, my friend's mom had already driven off. While walking, I noticed there aren't a lot of kids on this street, but maybe that means more candy for us. One of my friends says, "I don't think this is the right street," and starts to look around sort of frantically. These houses don't even look like they have people in them, my other friend tells us. My internal thoughts are that we should just walk back up the hill, maybe even cross to another neighborhood, and then meet their mom in the same hour we agreed to. But I'm too nervous to speak my opinion, so instead, I start following them further down the hill, across the street, down another neighborhood. I'm starting to lose my sense of direction and really hope one of these two has it figured out. Eventually we reach a path. It's clearly a defined path through some trees, likely into another neighborhood. However, it's incredibly dark. It's not a lit path by any means. I'm really hoping we don't opt to take that path. Of course we do. Both of them leading the way, I walk behind them hesitantly, watching as they're slowly swallowed by the darkness in front of us. How are neither of them commenting on the darkness? Why am I the only one who feels pause in this situation? Surrounded by darkness now, I almost decide to pipe up and ask what the plan was. But one of them says, "There's a neighborhood just on the other side of all of this. They'll have candy." But right as he says that, he sort of trips over something, and we all literally freeze in place. We don't have phones, but our eyes are slowly adjusting to the darkness. I remember I have a small reflector flashlight thing my mom gave me, telling me to wear it on my chest. I didn't, but it was in my pocket. The two of them argue about there being no light and who's gonna touch the ground to see what it is. As they do, I slowly walk over, handing them the reflector. One grabs it, presses the button, and points it towards the ground. For some reason, the reflector is stuck in strobe mode, so it's not a steady light, but it is incredibly bright. In a strobe-like scene, I see a bag of candy on the ground. I then see someone sitting against a tree in the pitch black. I guess they don't see it though, because they just go to grab the bag of candy. As they do, the man stands up. He's incredibly tall. I mean, I was a 4th grader, but this man was towering, and he, of course, was wearing some sort of facial covering, all black. It was like one of those blue man group suits, but all shiny black. Sure, it was Halloween, But this was no child. He's now standing perfectly still, watching us, I can only assume, because though faceless, he's staring in our direction. I'm frozen, while my friends continue to squeal over the jackpot of candy they just found. I can't bring myself to scream or move, but the man, the figure, he starts to move, and that's enough to encourage some noise from me. Guys, leave it. Guys, look. I point in the direction of the man. My two friends move the strobe light in the direction, and we all see this tall, black thing towering over the two of them as they crouched on the ground, and just a few feet from myself. There's a sort of stillness all around us at this moment. I can only hear my own breathing and my own heartbeat, which is speeding up with every breath. The two of them immediately scramble back and hop to their feet. They stand only a moment in front of the guy, the thing. And before we can run away, the thing reaches out and grabs one of them by the shoulders. Both me and the other friend grab our friend's arm and hands. We start pulling against this monster of a man. The friend being grabbed is now screaming, and I'm hopeful a neighbor will run out or something. As we continue to play tug of war with our friend's body, I can see lights in the distance, maybe flashlights since they seem to be pointed in random directions. They're moving fast, so I feel someone is running toward us, towards the screaming. Suddenly, the resistance gives, and all three of us go tumbling towards the ground, piling into one another. The strobe light is still flashing on the ground, offering us enough terrifying light to see that we're alone. The tall monster of a man is gone. I look back towards the end of the trail. Those lights are still around, making their way directly toward us now. It's people, and it was flashlights. I grab the strobe light and stand up. "Over here," I shouted towards the crowd, shocking even myself at the volume of my voice. I was screaming it out, no longer too nervous to speak. We hear rustling in the bushes, and I feel both of my friends grab my legs. I face the strobe light in that direction, and we're all shocked at what we see. We don't speak a word. Slowly, a child in a Hulk costume comes walking out of the brush, covered in mud, dirt, clearly upset and crying, scrapes and tears in their costume. The child couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, much smaller than us. As he approached us, we heard a woman screaming out, and several pairs of running feet. The woman was saying something like, my baby," and she scooped up the child quickly, crying and holding him. The scene got chaotic pretty fast. Lots of people, some of them officers, even some other kids. Everyone was so emotional, and I just looked down at my friends, asking if they were all right. Before they could answer me, there was an officer standing next to me, asking the same thing of all three of us. My friend said nothing, so I explained to the officer what we just seen, what we just experienced. What we'd learned was that this child had gone missing less than an hour before we'd gotten dropped off. The whole neighborhood had been alerted and were told to stay inside. There were several kids trick-or-treating, and while on the path, a large man approached quickly. He reached for the 2 small children and had gotten away with one, the boy we'd seen, disappearing into the night. Other children ran away instantly to tell their parents what happened. Well, we're lucky they came back the way they did. I don't know what would have happened to us, or even to that little boy. An officer stayed with us until our friend's mom came. He explained the situation, and she got us home really quickly, passing the information along to my parents and my friend's parents. At least it goes down as my scariest Halloween experience ever. Otherwise, it's just the worst. Not only did we not get any candy, but they also never caught the guy. Pretty impossible to get any sort of description. So it was a nervous few months around town. People weren't too quick to forget about it the next Halloween either. Be careful out there, everyone.
This happened over a decade ago, but I only recently found this sub and I think it's a good fit. It was Halloween of 2008. I was in college and still in a relationship with my first serious boyfriend. We'd been together since high school and it took this night to show me our relationship was abusive. It took one more incident before I finally left him for good. He was wonderful when sober, but intense and controlling when he was drunk. I learned he was truly terrifying. This was the first such incident that truly scared me. He joined in a stupid game, a Gatorade and Shine challenge. They'd empty a bottle of Gatorade at least halfway, fill the rest up with moonshine. The goal was to finish the bottle within an hour and then tell them crazy stories. Well, he completed the challenge, but he never did tell his friend the story. He couldn't remember most of it, and it painted him in a horrific light. I knew things were heading downhill when he started calling me a slut after saying hi to a guy friend at the party we were at. I decided we'd better head home before he got any worse. I thought I could nip it in the bud, manage it. We get home and change out of our costumes. James wants to have sex, but in his state and after what he'd call me, I wasn't interested. Oddly enough, it led him to calling me a whore. I left the apartment to go smoke. Our neighbors were having a party and 2 guys were outside smoking as well. They came over to see if I was okay. I'd been crying and they'd heard the yelling. I said I was, which they could obviously see was a lie. They let me know if I needed help, they'd help me. James chose that moment to come outside, said he'd heard us and told them to get away from me, stalking towards them. I stood up to get between them. They told me they'd meant what they'd said and not to forget it, then told him to watch himself. I was facing them to say bye and thanks for the offer when one of the guys gasped, staring at my boyfriend in shock. I turned around and my eyes immediately caught on the ground. Just as what I was seeing registered, the other guy lunged forward and grabbed me, pulling me behind him. What was on the ground that had elicited such reactions, you ask? Blood. Blood was dripping on the ground from his hand. He was holding a knife so tightly, he sliced his own hand open. I begged him to drop it, which he only agreed to when I walked back towards him. I was an idiot, I know. The 2 guys seemed at a loss, and I feel so bad for them having their Halloween ruined by this scary, crazy bullshit. They left me to it after I swore I'd be fine, reiterating that I could come to them for help. We got inside and I immediately started hiding all sharp objects, called James's roommates, begging them to come home. He started screaming to give him the knives back, how I was a slut and if I wouldn't even fuck him, what use was I? I called my parents and left, then called his mom because I was scared he'd hurt himself. She let me know how he was my problem now. I should have called the police but didn't want to ruin his life. I know. I'm ashamed to say I got back together with him for 6 more months of hell after that. But today, I can safely say, James, please, let's not meet ever again.
My cliche scary Halloween story. I feel cliche calling this my Halloween story, but all these events transpire between multiple days leading up to Halloween. I'll first admit that I wasn't a great older brother growing up. My brother and I are best friends now, close as can be, but in elementary school, we endured a stint of hating each other's guts. I'm a couple of years older than him, so this would be sometime around when I was in 6th grade and my brother was in 4th grade. We have also established our relationship. His name is Chris, and that's how I will reference him from now on. Mid-October, late 1990s, Chris and I are in the McDonald's drive-thru with our mom. Our Happy Meals are handed to us, and we each get a Halloween plastic bucket. I get the ghost and Chris gets the pumpkin. He doesn't want the pumpkin because he thinks the face is scary. Being the brother I am, I decide to taunt him with the bucket and belittle his feelings. He cries, and I'm scolded for my antics. But as my mom turns to yell at me, she doesn't notice the car in front of her has stopped, and she rear-ends the end of the truck in front of us. The man gets out, and he's not really upset, even though there's now a pretty good ding in his rear bumper. He looks in the car and smiles at us. He's tall with a booming baritone voice. As he leans near the driver's window, he speaks kindly with my mom and asks our names while exchanging information with my mom before getting back into his truck. When the man in front leaves the parking lot, he takes a left. We make a right. My mom was a little shaken up, but not enough to direct her straight back toward me. My head is against the passenger window and I'm still looking into the rearview mirror on my door. I notice the white Toyota make a U-turn and start to follow our car. My mom is still pissed at us, so I hold my tongue for the moment. She doesn't notice yet, but the white Toyota stays behind us for quite some time, only abandoning the pursuit when we pulled into our neighborhood. Days pass and the event becomes a forgotten blip as the excitement for Halloween ramps up. My mom spent more time we could appreciate stitching together the cat dog costume we'd been wearing that night. If you don't know Cat Dog, it was an American cartoon where the main characters are, as you would probably guess, a cat and a dog, but they're Siamese twins. So my brother and I were attached via a big fabric tube sewn to our backs. This was our first Halloween without our mom, and she was more than delighted to make a costume that would force me to keep an eye on my brother. As the sun sets, we're out the door. The fabric tube bends enough for us both to walk side by side, but for comfort, I make my brother walk backwards as I lead the way. There were about 5 houses in our little cul-de-sac loop before you'd be opposite of our house. Then we'd walk up the block and do that again. Turning onto the next block, etc. I noticed an eerily familiar white truck sitting idling about 40 yards deep. The interior is dark, but I can see a red ember glow of a cigarette, as well as a small exhale of smoke coming out of the driver's side window, signifying that someone is there. I ask my brother if he also thinks this is the same truck from the McDonald's. We spin while walking, so my brother is now in front. He confirms and tells me he can see the big ding our mom had left. We spin back around. We can still hit a couple of houses without going past the truck. Innocently, my brother asks me if the man will ask us for money to fix the ding. At the moment, at that age, I was like, oh crap, yeah, maybe he would. Before we get to the first house fence post, I see the cigarette get flicked out the window, and he's stepping out of the now illuminated truck. He pleasantly shouts our names as if running into old friends. Then he begins to walk towards us. Again, I immediately advised him that our mother wasn't with us tonight, and at that moment and age, even worse, I follow up with, we're all alone out here and don't have money to fix his bumper. He laughs and tells us he's not there for the money. Then he spins a fictional tale about how he's obtained too much candy tonight and needs to get rid of some, and that he didn't want it to go to waste, and remembered 2 young men going trick-or-treating that may want some of it. My brother shouts, wow, now I feel obligated to follow him back to his idling truck, so my little brother can have some of the candy. And I don't have to reject his oddly kind gesture, you know? I almost felt indebted to him for how cool he was being about the dent, and I think he could tell. Anyway, On the walk there, I let my brother walk in front as the man tells him about the variety of sweets he'll soon have access to. With me facing the house, I notice it's pretty dead out here, and we may be the only kids on this particular street. I asked the guy, "Hey, where'd you get all this candy anyway?" My brother follows it up with asking if he went trick-or-treating. The man laughs, but he doesn't answer either of our question. Instead, he opens what I assume is the truck door and tells us to hold on just 1 second while he grabs the candy. And just like that, I feel a strong pull on my costume. Before I can even harp on my brother for moving like an idiot, he's screaming, "Let go of me! Let go of me!" And again, a strong pull, almost taking me to the ground. Instinctually, I pull back using my weight to pull myself forward. It's then I realize this guy has a hold of my brother, and by the sheer design of my costume my mother made, he's got a hold of me too. The man is desperately trying to silence my brother, and he succeeds by putting his hand over his mouth to muffle the scream. So I took over, yelling precisely what my brother was and adding, "Help! He's got my brother!" The man seems to grow even more frustrated and seems to pull even harder as he physically picks my brother up. The costume chokes me but doesn't rip. He's picking up and putting down my brother like a rag doll, but without me budging. He can't do anything to get my brother free. I felt him try to grab at me and lift me off the ground, so I spin around. I'm in the position where I'm next to my brother. I realize he can't get us both. I look the guy dead in the eyes, lean over, and bite the hand he's holding over my brother's mouth as hard as I can. He smacks my face away as he removes his hand. He gets in real close and tells me to shut the fuck up, or he will snap our necks. My brother went cold when he said that. I'll never forget it. Terrified, I just keep screaming. I'm yelling in his face and he's looking around. For the first time, I can see he's frantic. He's attempting to cover my mouth with no success. As he tries again, my brother picks back up with the screaming. It seems like so much happened in such a small window of time. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than a minute, maybe 2 at most. Just as I start to hit this guy as hard as I can hear someone, a new voice. I turn my head but can't entirely move my body due to the man's newfound grip on my costume. But then, sweet release, the man let go of our outfit. Without even a second thought, I yell at my brother to run and we book it. Looking back only once, I could see the truck taking off in the opposite direction. But I can also see a group of neighbors standing there where we were, more coming out of their houses and some calling out to us. We don't stop and we ran all the way home. But not before going inside, we promised each other that we wouldn't tell our mom what happened. Why? We feared that we would never be able to trick-or-treat again. For some reason, we thought we would be the ones in trouble for almost getting kidnapped, which I guess messed us up for quite some time. As a kid, you can only feel safe in so many areas. So be careful, watch your kids and stuff because you never know who might be out there also watching them.
The Ghost That Sighed. This happened in the late 90s when I worked at the Pentagon and lived in Alexandria, Virginia. It was nearing Halloween, and they had an old town Alexandria ghost tour. My wife had to work, but she told me to go on the tour if I wanted to, by myself. It was going to be cold that night, but my wife had given me a warm overcoat that came down just behind my knees. It went just like you'd expect. The tour guide lady in old-timey clothes led the group around, maybe a dozen or so people, to different places in the city and told us stories about X died here in a duel and people hear and see his ghost at times. That kind of thing. The tour ended at some church that George Washington prayed at or something. I can't remember which church, it was over 20 years ago. But I looked up historic churches before typing this. So it may have been Christ's Church in Alexandria. Don't hold me to that though. Anyway, the church was obviously closed, but the grounds were not. We stopped on the side of the church by a door as the tour guide lady told us some spooky story. She was in front of the door. We all stood on a brick walkway as she spoke, facing her. There was maybe about 10 feet of space from the church to a brick wall. And there were a few grave markers in the grassy area before the brick wall. There was no one to my left. As the lady spoke, I heard a heavy sigh directly behind me. I turned. No one was behind me. Just a few grave markers and a wall. I looked to my right, and there was a guy on the tour listening intently to the tour lady. I figured it was my imagination, but then, a few seconds later, I heard it again, and it seemed even louder, like someone was doing it on purpose to get me to look. Again, I looked behind me. Nothing. I looked at the guy to my right and asked, "Did you hear that?" He looked at me, a bit annoyed, and said, "Hear what?" I was certain I heard a heavy sigh. This guy was the only person close enough to me to have heard it, and he said he didn't. I know he wasn't the source of the sound. Then, the lady finished her story and told us we were free to explore the cemetery behind the church. The crowd dispersed into it. I was wondering by myself when I saw 2 women by a tombstone. It was one of those tabletop kind of tombstones. I don't know if they have a special name or anything. The tombstone was about 10 feet from the wall of the cemetery. People had been putting pieces of Halloween candy on it. So I walked over and asked the women why people put candy on this particular grave. They said they didn't know and walked off before I could ask whose grave it was. But I was curious, so I took out my lighter and tried to read the name on the stone. I figured I could look it up later. I couldn't make out the name, as the stone was really worn and my lighter didn't give me a lot of light. Then, I heard it, a heavy sigh, followed by breathing as if someone was trying to catch their breath after exerting themselves. I spun around. No one. No one was even remotely close to me. No one was within at least 30 feet of me. I said out loud, "Okay, who is doing that?" Even as I spoke, I kept thinking, this has got to be my imagination. Another heavy sigh and breathing. This time I know I heard it. Right behind me. And of course, no one was even close by. And that's when all of my army training boiled down to the 2-mile run. Boiled down to the 2-mile PT run. I took off. I bolted. No thought required. I booked on out of there at top speed, and I kept running until I got a few blocks away to my car and went home. I was unnerved even when I got home. My wife and a friend were watching TV at this time, and I told them what happened. They both laughed, and maybe only believed that I heard something that sounded like what I thought it was. I said, "Fine, let's all go and I'll show you the place." They made no secret that they were in the "nope, because you may be right" category, and chickened out of that. I never did go back to that cemetery. Kinda wish I had. I still want to know why the candy, and whose grave was it?
A few years back, my now husband and I were living with my mom. My husband had started a new job where he was working 14-hour shifts and wouldn't get home until 11 p.m. My brother liked to go out, so he also wasn't home. This meant that my mom and I were home alone on Halloween. We lived on a busy street, so we ran out of candy at around 9 p.m. My mom put a sign on the door, and then we went to bed. For some background, we had 5 dogs in the house, and at this point, my brother was about 21 years old and I was 22. My brother has a female German Shepherd / Husky mix named Coco, and she is very good at reading our body language. Our screen door had a large window and didn't lock, and our main door didn't have a view window. So the doorbell rings around 11:30 p.m., and I got up instantly and ran to the door. I stupidly assumed, without a thought or two, that it was my husband coming home from work. I opened the door without thinking, and there were 2 very large people wearing black hoodies and black sweats. I knew the screen door didn't lock, so I realized that this was a bad situation. My mom had heard the doorbell as well, so she was also walking to the door. My husband had the keys to the house, so my mom, having good instincts, realized that it wasn't him and decided to come with me to the door. I was stunned and I didn't say anything, but my mom comes from behind me and aggressively says, "Can I help you?" And before they can even speak, Coco jumped up at the glass and started barking and growling at them. When her paws pushed on the door, it opened slightly and the two people took a step back. They both just said, "Trick or treat." And my mom said, "Don't you see the sign? We're out of candy." Then the two people walked away. My husband came home 15 minutes later and we told him what had happened. Coco for sure saved us from a bad situation. She never acts that aggressively when people come to the door. The next morning, we saw on the news a few blocks away that two people that matched the description of the two people that came to our door were shot and killed because they tried to rob the home of an off-duty police officer. And the time of the incident was 30 minutes after the two people came to our door.
A few years back on Halloween night, my security company was scheduled for a special event in one of our patrol areas. The Old North End neighborhoods in Colorado Springs is 89 square blocks of historic homes dating as far back as the 1800s. On Tijon Street, every year the community organizers hold a big trick-or-treat event. Old spooky houses, killer yard decorations, great costumes. It's truly a great outing. I was scheduled for the 8 hours that night from 4 p.m. to midnight because I was the only officer with an available marked company cruiser. The first several hours were pretty normal, helping the CSPD locate lost kids to their parents, drunk college kids from the nearby campus, or drunk dads staggering around with their kids, and making sure no fights broke out. It wasn't until after 10 p.m. that the truly bizarre began to take place. For Halloween in Colorado Springs, it was surprisingly mild out, so I decided to patrol mostly on foot, just moving my car to a different zone every hour and a half. Around 10:15, a small group of teens decided to try to scary clown prank me while driving to my next zone. This wasn't a good idea on their part. As soon as two of them had started chasing my police cruiser waving axes over their head, I slammed into park and came out, drawn on them. They immediately decided to throw their axes down. One made a plastic thud, and the other made a metallic clanking. After both were successfully detained, and I was on the phone with the parents of one of the kids, I noticed from my periphery that a lumbering figure with reddish-orange eyes was glaring at me from the shadows of an alleyway. Assuming it was another pranking teen, I shouted, "It's late, kid, head home." After a few seconds more of glaring, the figure turned and disappeared deeper into that alley. Just before 10:45, I was finishing up with the boys' parents. They spent some time chastising them on how stupid they were for doing the scary clown prank, and how they were lucky nothing worse happened or them getting arrested by PD. The boys left in their parents' car, and I headed to the fire station to use their bathroom. While there, after using the head, one of the firefighters was telling me, since I was on foot, to mostly look out for any Ouija boards that have been set on fire in the alleys throughout the Old North End. I thought he was joking, as he handed me a Dr. Pepper, but then followed that they had already responded to 3 incidences in a 4-block area. Then I went up to the elementary school and parked. I figured I'd check the alleyway heading south from the school's drop-off. The alley was down to the community's border. Not before I hit the mouth of the first crossing street. A simmering board was found with the planchette still burning, standing straight. While on the phone with the firehouse giving the location, I saw the figure from before, but slightly clearer. I acted like I didn't see him while I was still on the phone, so I could examine him. He stood tall, maybe 6.5 feet tall, a pale face with long sideburns, slicked back, dark brown hair, and a jagged overbite. Most importantly of all, the eyes that gave a glimpse of an orangey-red glow. Like raccoon or cat eyes when light reflects on them. I told the station house that nothing was close enough to start a secondary fire, and gave the location once more. After I got off the phone, I shouted at the person, "Hey, do you know anything about this?" The figure began fleeing down the alleyway. In quick pursuit, I followed. "Central, show me in chase of a possible arsonist. Have PD meet at San Miguel at the mouth of the southbound alleyway." I chased and ordered the individual to stop, trying to spot him with my light, but I couldn't keep pace. He was clearing potholes, curbs, and hazards like they were nothing. He then suddenly stopped dead and turned. With an unnerving smile, he stared at me almost menacingly. I pulled my taser, as I didn't know what he was about to do. As my laser sight found his chest, I was staggering to find my breath. He gave out a horrid hiss. I started to see the red and blue code lights of the CSPD police cars behind me. Instantly, a flash coming from this creep blinded me and I lost sight. I looked back, and he was gone. The police slid to a stop and popped out around me. Seeing the flash too, some asked where the guy went, and the other one asked why I fired my gun. I showed my taser was still in my hand and hadn't discharged. The other two cops backed me by saying they saw someone, but that he also disappeared. One of the guys didn't believe any of us. The 4 police cars then searched the entire North End and surrounding neighborhoods. No one matching the description of what I saw was seen. Before midnight, I went back to the firehouse to see if they had any headache pills or something like that. While sitting in their lounge area, one of the firefighters told me something rather odd. On all the burnt spirit boards, they had found that only parts on each of them were untouched by flame. The moon symbol and the goodbye symbol. So I'm wondering if what I chased was a ghoul, spirit, demon, or prankster. Either way, I don't intend on walking down the old North End neighborhood alleyways around Halloween time, unless absolutely necessary.
In 2016, I was a junior in high school. I didn't live far from my school, but it was still an hour walk. I was in pretty good shape back then, and didn't mind walking the dog when my older sibling couldn't pick me up due to work. My parents were both at work, and I hated asking friends for rides because it just felt bummy. So anyway, I start walking home on a nice September day in Florida. About 5 minutes down the road, I got the feeling like someone was looking at me, and I turned around. Standing there, about 50 feet away, was a clown. This was back when the killer clown sightings were at an all-time high. It was late September, so I assumed this was just an early Halloween prank and shrugged it off. I turned back around and kept going. Another 5 minutes went by and I couldn't shake the feeling a clown was following me. Again, I turned around and he was about 30 to 40 feet away now. I was, needless to say, pretty nervous. I turned around when I heard a snap. Next to me, just inside the bushes between subdivision, was another clown. It was clear this wasn't a prank anymore. Sensing I was in danger, I started sprinting when the first one from behind me ran too, saying, "Fucking grab him." The second clown chased after me as well. I could clearly hear his footsteps behind me. I scanned nearby houses and thankfully I saw a police cruiser in a driveway. I got there and banged on the door until someone answered. The cop, seeing me shaken up, looked around and saw one of the two holding a decently sized hunting knife and told them to freeze. They both bolted and I never heard anything about their capture. To this day, clowns still unsettle me, and I cannot see a picture of any of them. Whether it just be a party clown or Pennywise, without thinking back to the time I possibly almost died.
Jewelry Glitch. Read by Lady Spookaria. I worked on Halloween this year, and took advantage of being able to ditch my uniform and dress up. As part of my vampire getup, I wore a bunch of jewelry, namely a bunch of rings. Specifically, I had on knuckle rings that kept sliding off throughout the day. I'm usually in charge of cleaning bathrooms before I leave for the day, so is the case on Halloween. As I'm grabbing some nylon gloves, I considered taking my rings off, but decided not to, as the gloves were slightly too small and wouldn't allow for my rings to move. Just before I put the gloves on, I dropped one of the knuckle rings and heard it hit the floor with a loud ting ting ting. I slipped it back on, checked my other rings and put my gloves on. I'm female, so I only go into the men's bathrooms to clean them. As I'm finishing up and sweeping the men's, I look down and there's one of my rings. The rings are cheapos from Walmart, so I was thinking maybe someone had dropped their own. But when I remove the glove to look at my hand, my ring is gone. There's no way that ring could have gotten off my finger and out of the glove and hit the cement floor without making a sound. Plus, I hadn't removed my gloves since I put them on.
This happened about 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, including myself, and 1 girl, and they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. It's perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off a busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving for about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting lost intentionally. Our cars made a turn, and to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was. We stepped over the log and noticed 2 narrow trails leading in different directions. This seemed like as good of a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by the branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as just my imagination. And in any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What could we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing, and I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass, comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. Trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we couldn't see the end of it from where we were standing. I was thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned, and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I managed to peer between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live here, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we decided to walk closer to the trail that we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he just pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. And by dancing, I mean it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same to another tree. Basically a do-si-do. The moon was so bright and the woods so dark, it actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him and I pointed in that direction, and I said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see this?" He squinted a bit, and the second he saw it, he gasped with everything that he had. He clutched my arm and whispered, "What in the world is that?" What happened next sent shock waves through all of us. Whoever this was, they stopped dancing. They looked in our direction and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy crap!" I looked back and I saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in less than 5. Once we were a safe distance away, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we're all still friends, living in different states, yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children. You get it. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others with something to the effect of, "The woods. That had really happened, right?" Well, it most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did he know we were there from the second we parked? Was he the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around and see what he was truly capable of.
Theater. A few years back, I was covering weekend shifts at a movie theater on the north side of Pueblo, Colorado. I don't remember the year, just that Hotel Transylvania 2 and a Tom Hanks spy movie was playing. I was armed security down there because the theater tended to see large numbers of customers, and sadly, those guests would smoke weed in the bathrooms, get into fistfights, and sneak into other theaters, so it was regularly a long shift. The shifts tended to be 5 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. when the last show got out for the night. I don't know any history of the theater, but right around October, odd occurrences began to spark off after 10 p.m. on Friday and Saturday nights. Usually, most kids and family movies didn't go past 10:45, so I only had teenagers and adults to contend with. One Saturday night, close to Halloween, events started to happen very frequently. At around 11, after some movies started their last showings, the assistant manager and I were walking the hallways and checking empty theaters. She was a young student at the university not far from the theater, very mature and straight-faced. While we were in the empty theater that just let out, we began seeing flashes of light, but not like the lights for the walkway or overhead, more like a flashlight, but an older, dimmer one. We couldn't find the origin of the light, so we assumed it was one of the technicians that would check on the reels and projection devices. After leaving the theater and checking on a smaller concession stand, I was leaning over the counter as she was collecting the money from the register, placing the cash in a bank bag. While standing there just talking about pointless junk, the soda machine started spraying from 3 of the 8 spouts. The assistant manager yelped and literally jumped backward. Frazzled, she grabbed the bank bag and declared that she was returning to the main office. I continued checking active theaters to ensure no one was conducting themselves inappropriately, and to my pleasant surprise, no one was doing anything that warranted me to get involved. I shortly after returned to the main lobby, where a few employees remained, all doing some end-of-the-night cleaning tasks. I, waiting for the second to last showing of the night to let out, decided to hang out in the little arcade to kill time. Sitting on a chair next to the Time Crisis 3 machine, I was mindlessly scrolling Facebook, regularly checking my watch to see if the movie was about to end, when a basketball shooting hoops game siren belted out and flashed. The assistant manager walked in and jokingly said, "Hit the high score?" I looked at her and then looked at the game. "I've been sitting over here for about 15 or 20 minutes, I said. She then told me that the siren only goes off when someone gets over a certain amount of points, but should not have sounded unless played. "There hasn't been anyone in here with me at all," I said. Going pale, she stated she was going on her last break for the night, and left out the side service door to have a cigarette. Finally, 2 hours after what happened in the arcade, the final movie of the night was getting out. I stood by the main exit, thanking people and telling them to have a good night. Just before the last group of people who straggled after using the restrooms left, the technician up in the projection hallway called for the assistant manager, stating that an issue just started. I walked to the theater the assistant manager was standing in, which was across the hallway from the last movie that was just let out. "Apparently the system hates us," she asserted. I replied with, "What's going on?" The technician joined us in the theater. A movie was starting and stopping the same 30-second scene, and it was skipping and restarting, like a song on a scratched CD. Because of this weird defect, the assistant manager released the regular staff and ushers for the night, but her, the technician, and I stayed for a while longer. The technician was able to stop and fix the issue, but I couldn't tell you what he did or even how the issue started. Now, the 3 of us were finally leaving, and it was just before 3 a.m. As the assistant manager was setting the alarm, the basketball arcade game's high score siren went off again. The technician and I went over to see if maybe someone was hiding in the arcade, but neither of us could find anyone. However, I remember standing in that little arcade looking around and taking note of how unusually cold it had become. Again, this was October in Colorado, so being cold is 50-50, but this literally felt like a blast of AC. After 10 minutes of not finding anything, we all left with no further incident. I, to this day, don't know if it was all odd occurrences or something paranormal, but I have a feeling a playful poltergeist made themselves known that night.
So I worked as a waitress at a little bar and grill while I was going to college. And one night in mid-October, my boss walked in as we were cleaning up for the evening. "If anyone that's not working on the 31st wants to come in to work the night shift, we could really use the help," he announced. Then he went on to explain that someone had filled a pretty big reservation list, so we expected it to be busy, blah blah blah. But the part I heard the loudest was, "You'll be paid time and a half." Well, out of the 4 other employees, one was already scheduled to work that night, and the other 2 didn't raise their hands to take the shift. So feeling slightly uncomfortable about the elongated silence, I spoke up, volunteering myself. In reality, I wouldn't be missing out on the Halloween parties, because I hadn't been invited to any. So my boss's open solicitation was honestly the first request for my presence to be anywhere. Not only requested, but appreciated. So yeah, I was happy to fill my empty calendar with an event. I was also excited to be making the extra money, as cigarettes in this college town are expensive compared to Oregon's tax-free prices. So Halloween night had arrived, and I'd put together a pretty decent female Where's Waldo costume, and my boss wasn't exaggerating when he said it was going to be busy. Around 1 o'clock I finally got to step out back for my first smoke break of the night, and one of our lovely cooks handed me a big black bag of trash to take out with me. Dragging the sack of garbage that was bigger than me, I managed to make my way out of the kitchen doors and into the alley. God saw my struggle, and I kid you not, I met the most handsome man. Granted, it was while he was pissing on the wall out back, but it was when he was done and how he helped me lift the bag into the dumpster that got me, and that's basically when we started flirting. He bummed a cigarette off me, and as he was lighting mine for me, like a gentleman, this drunk chick stormed around the corner. Now I can't be sure, but I think she was dressed as a chimney, and she looked mad, her eyes popping out of her skull, teeth grinding in a snarl. I looked at him with a, "Do you see that crazy lady over there?" look. But I quickly got the puzzle pieces of these 2 humans together, and saw that this dude was dressed like a house. His costume was way less extravagant than hers, and honestly, without the doorknob sewn onto his shirt, and now chimney girl in sight, I wouldn't have really understood his costume. She screamed his name, followed by, "Who's this bitch?" And he answered with some weird, unnecessary lie like, "She's my cousin." Obviously his counterpart didn't buy this, and she shattered a glass she'd been holding against the sidewalk, screaming obscenities at both of us. Not trying to be a part of this couple's quarrel, I slowly started stepping backwards towards the kitchen doors. But as I did, the chimney girl snatched a piece of broken glass off the ground and began to run at us. I sprinted to the kitchen doors, but they were locked from the outside, so I pounded on them, but it didn't seem I was getting anyone's attention. I noticed that she'd reached the guy first because he hadn't run, and he opened his arms, pleading with her not to do this. But the chimney lady slashed at him anyway, cutting his outstretched arm. Seeing this, I now know that she's not only serious, but she's probably done this before, and I didn't stand a chance if she got her hands on me. My purse with my phone and keys were inside the bar, so I had no choice but to run. But like a bear as I beat feet, she was right behind me, cussing and swinging the sharp chunk of glass. I literally ran the near 5-mile stretch back to my dorm, and I'm sure she'd stopped following me within the first mile. But the consequences for that miscalculation would cost me dearly, so I just kept running and running. Thankfully, when I got to the dorms, my roommate was there to let me in,
Then I used her phone to call the bar and tell them what had happened, but it kept going to voicemail. So I left a brief, out-of-breath message and tried to explain the best I could of what had just transpired. The next day I walked back to retrieve my belongings, and the glass was still littered on the sidewalk outside the kitchen doors. They were preparing for the brunch happy hour when I stepped back into the kitchen, when one of the morning cooks gave me a letter. It advised me of my termination for abandoning everyone on Halloween night. But I was grateful that evening when my boss called me, as after listening to the message I'd left and reviewing the security footage, he called me asking if I still wanted my job.
The Gas Station Clown. This took place back in 2014. I was 17 years old and I lived in a very small town in Massachusetts. And every night, I would take walks after sundown. I enjoyed it. It was peaceful. Now I understand that this whole setup is inherently sketchy, and walking around town in the dead of night is just asking for trouble. I was a very antisocial person, so I did it. Every night. I lived on a street about 4 miles long in total, and there would be a few houses every half mile or so. But for the most part, things were pretty secluded, other than a decently sized cemetery that I would sometimes hang out at. Side note, a woman had committed suicide at the cemetery after being involved in some white-collar scandal. I never knew her or her family, and I mean no disrespect to them. There was also another cemetery in town, which was pretty famous for alleged supernatural events that people used to do witchcraft in. Very popular amongst ghost hunters and people into cheap scares. So, our little town was kind of a hotspot for creepy stuff. The street had about 5 streetlights, and one of them was constantly bugging out and never got fixed. In order to get to the center of town, I'd have to walk a few miles, essentially in the pitch black darkness with nothing but a mag light, my headphones, and my cell phone. Past the cemetery, at the end of the street, there was this local donut shop, and then the center, and I would listen to music in the dark, with the flashlight being the only decent light for miles until I got into town. I would wear a long black pea coat. At one point I shaved my head completely bald, so that people would think I'm creepy and wouldn't bother me if they were driving down the road at that particular hour. The local police were familiar with me, my family, and our kind of messed up background. In 2013, my brother saved me from my dad after he tried to beat me up. He was beaten unconscious and the police were called. After that, he left, and I haven't seen him since. That's not related to the story in any way, but I think the cops realized I was a troubled kid, yet not out to do anything malicious. Clean record, no fighting, stealing, or anything like that, and they kinda let me do my thing. Anyways, it was Halloween night. I was on one of my evening patrols and had got into the center of town. At the town center, there is this 24-hour gas station called Cumberland Farms. If you live in New England, it's most likely where you fill your tank or buy overpriced snacks. As I walked up to the store, there was this extremely tall, slightly pot-bellied guy who was dressed like a clown, but his makeup made him look a bit more like Beetlejuice. He was staring at me with his eyes wide open and had a toothy grin. I pretty much figured it was Halloween and it was some guy trying to fuck with me for fun. So I said, "Happy Halloween, man," and kind of blew right past him into the store. I bought myself a soda and some candy, and when I walked out of the door, he wasn't there anymore. I continued my walk, put my headphones on, and forgot about the guy. The whole town center is connected on Route 9, Main Street, and when I wanted to get around town, that was the road I'd walk on. So as I continued on, I let go of every single bit of common sense I had at that time, blasted my music to the point where I couldn't hear anything else, and just started running on autopilot because I'd done this so many times. After walking about a mile away from the gas station, there was no cars on the road, and I started to feel a bit uneasy.
I looked back, and what do you know? This giant clown Beetlejuice looking guy is 5 feet behind me. The same expression on his face from before. Eyes wide, toothy grin. I also need to paint a picture of how tall this guy is. He must have been like 6'7", and essentially towering over me. I'm 5'8". I kind of stopped in my tracks, took my headphones off, and looked at him. He just passes right by me, says, "Happy Halloween!" in some weirdy-ass goofy clown voice, and continues walking down the street in front of me. That's the last interaction I have with him, but I keep my eyes on him as he continues walking. Last I saw him, he went into a subway parking lot and was peeking into the windows of people's cars. I got that the guy was clearly just trying to creep people out because it was Halloween night and it's fun. But the dude waited for me to leave the store out of sight and then proceeded to follow me down the street when I wasn't paying attention, just to say Happy Halloween and then dip. And I still had the entire length of the street my house was on to walk in the pitch black. Needless to say, I turned my music volume down and was constantly looking behind me my whole way home. Very creepy.
In elementary school, I was obsessed with the Power Rangers. I actually wanted to be Kimberly in real life, and I even begged my parents to let me take martial arts, which they did. I was terrible. So, naturally, when Halloween approached, I knew exactly what I wanted to be, the Pink Power Ranger. My mom was quite the seamstress, and she made my costume mostly from scratch. I tried to find pictures from this time period, but our family lost a lot, including our house a few years ago in the wildfires. This was in Preston County. Either way, take my word for it when I say it was awesome. My parents even painted a child's motorcycle helmet for me. Well, in my neighborhood, everyone participated in this thing called Trunk or Treat, where, essentially, one of the streets on our block was packed with parked cars, and they would keep their trunks open, filled with candy. It was pretty awesome, actually, and we looked forward to it almost every year. My parents were volunteering this year. They may have done that every year, which is sorta cool, but it was sorta lame this time. It meant that I'd have to wait a bit to go get the candy. As I patiently sat on the curb, waiting for my parents to be done, I busily looked around the street and side streets for something to entertain me. That was the moment my eyes became fixated on something truly magnificent. Something I hadn't seen yet, not today. It was another Pink Power Ranger, but full-sized. In my child brain, I was sure that I'd just laid eyes on the real Pink Power Ranger. I was but a fan, a fraud, but this was the real deal. I stood up, waved my mom over, tried to anyway. She gave me the signal for 1 minute, and so I waited. But I watched as she got more distracted. I knew it wasn't going to be a 1 minute kind of thing, more like forever. I was growing panicked. Pink Ranger looked like she was getting out of here. She was just barely out of view, just around the corner. I could still see part of her leg, her arm. She was so close, yet she was getting further away. Mom, still heavily distracted. So, I bolted. I knew that I could say hi and run back without anyone even noticing. I was almost to her, so close, just around the corner, and there she'll be. But she wasn't there. I looked around, frantically, and it hits me that she's magic, a Power Ranger. She's long gone. Feeling defeated, I hang my head, unsure what my next move will be. As I lift my head and I turn around, I notice that there's a car on the street with their trunk open. It's a little out of place. It's not on the main street like the others. The car was sort of a gold color, with a cool yellow and black stripe painted on the side, and atop the car was a beehive. Not a real one, a clearly cartoon one, a fake one, but it's painted, and it has what looks like honey dripping out of it. Pink Ranger is no longer on my mind. I must see this car. I must touch that honey. I make a run for it, and as I'm running, I feel that familiar feeling of being lifted off the ground. When you're that age, it's pretty common. It's the easier way to stop a young child. Just swoop them up and voila, no more running feet. So as my feet leave the ground, my mind thinks that it must be my mom, my dad, someone who knows me. I'm in trouble, I think, but I can't see their face because the way they're holding me. They've got me out in front of their body, away from their chest, and me facing forward. And momentarily, I'm at ease. Maybe I'm not in trouble. Why do I think this? Because we're headed in the direction of the car. We're headed right for the honey. I start to squirm around and I grab at the hands that are wrapped around my sides. As I grab and I look at them thoroughly, they aren't familiar. I immediately start to scream, and my screams, they only grow louder. As the man runs us directly past the honey car, he's taking me somewhere. My body goes into full flailing mode. I pull every single move that I've ever been told not to do when my parents try to control me with their hands. I'm throwing the kind of fit that's gotten me removed from restaurants and sent back home to think about what I've done. Kicking, screaming, shrilling my way out of his arms, rocking my body like a fish out of water. He's approaching a somewhat reddish car, and he's trying to keep a hold of me while also trying to open the door to this car. Effortlessly, he swings me under one arm while he gets the door open. I'm still flailing around, but I move my attention to his arm, which is now closer to my face, and he's got some sort of thick t-shirt on, but I don't hesitate. I lean forward and I bite this guy as hard as I can. At first, it's all fabric, but I use my hands to get a better grip, and I bite harder, at which point he drops me, my head hitting the side of the car, but I land on my knees. He tries to grab at me, and I slip through. At least I thought that's what happened, but I look at the guy, and he's now pushing me out of the way, kicking me sort of into the street. I watch as he rushes into the car and speeds away. Before I'm on my feet, I hear something that sounds like running coming from the main street. For a minute, my little brain panics and I think, no, not again. But that's when I see it's a large crowd of adults, my parents included. They're running and they're almost to me. I feel the familiar feeling of being swept up off my feet, this time from my mom, but instantly I'm just crying. This is where my parents sort of fill in the gaps for me. I truly just don't have the pieces. Back in 1999, my parents' English was practically non-existent. I was the English-speaking one in the family. My family was hesitant to call the police because my grandmother, who lived with us at the time, she wasn't doing so legally. Things just weren't exactly the same as they are now, or maybe they are. But from what I understand, it was like a don't ask, don't tell kind of situation in that part of Southern California. Don't rock the boat. And calling the police was absolutely looked at as rocking the boat. Still, my parents reported the incident. Not much came of it. My mom wasn't sure that they were taken seriously, that I was taken seriously. I can hardly remember talking to the police, so maybe that goes to show how reliable or helpful my testimony was. I was so focused on the car with the honey that I really couldn't provide any details about the guy's actual car. Even now, I really only recall that it was a dark red color, a tall man, because who isn't tall when you're like 5? He smelled like cigarettes, and his shirt, it tasted like pennies, at least how they smell. There's no way to really know who this guy was, an amateur, a pro, no clue. But what I do know is that I was never able to shake the feeling that I was incredibly lucky to get away how I did. This man's plans for me were nothing but pure evil, and I've always known that I was only seconds away from never seeing the light of day again. And unlike most details about that day or the man, that feeling has only grown and grown over the years. I would call it more than a feeling. It's fact. So, keep your kids close, always. I still find stories like these on the internet. Read news articles that are practically replicas of my story. Monsters absolutely still exist, and they absolutely still come out on Halloween. True horror doesn't care about cliches. "16 years ago, I was at a big Halloween party at a rather fancy house. I didn't personally know the owners, but rather I was the date to someone who worked for these people. We'd only been there for about an hour when suddenly the entire mood shifted. One moment, the whole home was filled with laughter and music, and the next, just like a movie, it was filled with screams. One followed by another. Soon, a roar of screams, in unison.
Somebody call 911.
A man yelled from the top floor into the foyer. People scrambling to find a phone, a group of people running up the stairs as an even larger group makes their way down the stairs, clashing with one another as half of them move in sheer panic, the other with determination. I ask my date, what the hell's going on? But he's as confused as I am. I then hear a woman frantically trying to explain what happened, while another tries to relay the information over the phone. "She fell," was all that I could manage to hear. I tell my date, maybe we should get out of here on account of everything being a bit insane right now. He tells me to grab my coat, and he's going to meet me at the front to get our car. I waited for what feels like forever. Finally, my date meets me outside. He looks pale, and he's not rushing to me or anything. There's no urgency about him. But he grabs my shoulder and he says,
"I just saw a dead body."
And then he keeps walking, moving me along with him, but not saying anything else. We drove home in silence, just watching as several ambulances and police pass us along the way. It's not until later the next day that I get the details. It was a woman. She fell out of a window on the 3rd floor, broke her neck on the concrete decking surrounding the outdoor pool area below the windows. It doesn't go down as my best date in history or the best Halloween, but definitely the most haunting in both categories. In Pasadena, California, there's a bridge that's been the site of nearly 200 suicides over the past 100 years. During the week of Halloween, me and my girlfriend decided to go to the haunted or creepy places in LA County. We'd heard of the bridge and decided to go. At 1 a.m., we took a 20-minute drive there. When we got there, we drove slowly just to admire the bridge and take it all in. As we drove towards the middle, we got a heavy, sinking feeling in our stomachs and our heads. It felt like someone was physically crushing us all over. I physically felt stuck and out of nowhere, really sad. She freaked out, and we both agreed to get the hell out of there. But the car accelerator failed for that moment. I could feel myself get cold all over, and then it worked again. We hit a U-turn and got out. Since then, And for the past few days, I've been feeling depressed. I've had other experiences with physically seeing figures, but I've never felt such a feeling as that, ever in my life. We avoid this street at all costs now, and we took a deep dive into the history of the people that took their lives there. Such a sad feeling it left me with. Growing up in central Louisiana, I'd always heard of Frenchtown Road, how it was haunted, how there was a witch, various cult activities, and KKK meetings. My dad always told me he would bring me to Frenchtown, but the first time I went was Halloween night, 2020, around 12 p.m. Me, 3 of my friends, and their mom, who was driving, decided to drive down Frenchtown to check out an old abandoned building that my friends had been to a few times. So, in the dark, we drive down Frenchtown Road, and under the bridge that's notorious for cars mysteriously stopping under it and people being hung from it. You can read about it in the Weird Louisiana book or Google it. We eventually got to a driveway and parked. And we all got out and made the trek towards the old house, in the dark, through a field. My friends had checked the house out around 2 weeks back, and it was still there. But when we got to the house, there was nothing there but the foundation, with no signs of construction or debris. And there was grass growing over the foundation. After freaking out a bit, and standing on the foundation and scaring each other, we decided to head back to the car. Now, this is when things get much crazier and, well, paranormal. We all get in the car, and it won't start. Everyone except me and my best friend were flipping out, but eventually the car started. We quickly pulled off, but not a minute after we got to the bridge, probably going around 40 miles per hour, the second we were under that bridge, the car shuts off. My friend's mom was hyperventilating and crying, trying to get the car to start again. This was the most upset I'd ever seen her. After about 2 minutes, in the pitch black, the car just started again, and we got the hell out of there. One of my friends said that she saw a figure in a white dress in the road. This was on the way back, but it could have just been nerves. To this day, though, this is the most unexplainable thing to have ever happened to me, and I fully believe it was paranormal in nature. So, if you ever read about Frenchtown Road, believe what you will, but I'm here to tell you it's true.